Welcome to Chain Reaction, the Foreign Policy Research Institute's flagship network of podcast series examining the political, security, economic, and social trends shaping Europe and Eurasia. Throughout the year, we're talking with experts about developments in Russia's war in Ukraine, the new European security order, the past, present, and future of the Baltic states, Russia's political economy, and great power competition in the region. Join us each month for
Bear Market Brief.
The understanding of Russia, which is broadly as Russia as a great power that has its own special path, that has a mission and that needs a strong state, and a different path to that of the West.
I think when you look at these other industries, what you find is that there's a lot of pain built up in different parts of the Russian economy. Some of it's only going to be felt over a longer period of time.
Baltic ways.
There were the countries that when the war started, they were willing to be, those voices of moral conscience.
The continent.
I think that this conflict today proves that we are able to go past grievances and that we are able to look into the future, into the common future together.
Report in short.
This is the real Achilles heel of Putin's mobilization.
And of course, our flagship, Chain Reaction.
These two countries are interacting militarily, or have been interacting in several different conflicts, and in some cases they're on the same side, and in some cases they're not.
New episodes are available each week on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. This week on the continent.
Who is going to win Turkey's election? And if you weren't following that Turkey is about to have an election, who's even running? What's at stake? Welcome to the continent. I'm Aaron, a fellow here at FPRI, and on this podcast, I'm learning all about how the war in Ukraine is affecting politics, society, and security in Europe. Each month, I'll be visiting a country or an issue and speaking with specialists and locals about what people need to know. I would emphasize here that I'm not approaching this as an expert. I'm here to learn, and I'm excited you're on this learning journey with me. Now, this is the second season of this podcast, if you will, and so this time around, we'll be visiting some new places and topics, but also retreading some ground we've covered before. What's evolved over a year of war in Ukraine? That's what we're doing this time. The results of the Turkish election are going to matter profoundly for NATO, Ukraine, Europe, and beyond. And so let's get down to business. Joining us today are two experts on all things Turkey. First is James Ryan, Director of Research and of the Middle East Program here at FPRI. He has a PhD in history from the University of Pennsylvania and writes frequently on contemporary and historical Turkish and Middle Eastern politics. Second, but none the lesser, is Selim Koru, who is also a fellow here at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Does that make him a fellow? And an analyst at the Economic Policy Research Foundation of Turkey, where his research focuses on Turkish politics and foreign policy. Before joining the foundation, he worked and interned at various media organizations. Selim holds a BA in history from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and an MA in international relations and economics from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Thanks to both of you for joining today. Let's dive straight in with a couple of introductions. We'll start with you, Jim. Tell us about what you're focused on these days.
So I'm a historian by training. So this is, an election happening with a lot of historical significance. So, a lot of what I'm trying to read into this election are, one, what does this mean for Turkey's long trajectory and path, towards and away from democratization? And what does Turkey's history tell us is possible? How can history be a guide to what may happen in this election? And how does it fall short of being a guide? How does it tell us when we've arrived somewhere completely new? So those are the things that I'm focused on right now.
Well, we have lots of ground to cover on that front today. Selim, over to you. Quickly introduce yourself.
I've been a think tanker based in Ankara I started about a decade ago, I guess, 10 years ago. And more, I found myself sort of pivoting towards writing more about sort of political ideas and political theory. And I'm now doing a PhD on sort of political ideas in general. I'm looking at sort of 19th century Germans, but I find that that's really relevant to Turkey. And in this election, I mean, I sort of have my analyst hat on and sort of try to predict what's going to happen or what's more likely and what's less likely. I also like to think about sort of the ideas that are being bounced around and sort of what direction the country is going towards, and how the sort of center of gravity is shifting.
A lot of grounds to cover today, so let's jump in. Let's start with what I used to call doing this podcast the Mr. Rogers question: who are the people in your neighborhood? And we have two leading candidates here, so wanted to do for listeners and for myself, frankly, a quick rundown of this Erdogan versus Kılıçdaroğlu question. What are the key platform points of each, and who tends to support each candidate? Well, let Selim take first whack at this.
Yeah, the alignment. I think, well, nowadays we're kind of used to this sort of far right authoritarian or quasi-authoritarian leader, taking charge. Sometimes called in like the Eastern European sense, post-fascist. Sometimes it's just called nationalist, the far right nationalist. Erdogan really was one of the first guys, or perhaps even the first big one of that mold. Really, what you see today in India, what you see partly, in Russia, it's a little different. It's a little very, very, it's extremely dominant. But what you see the beginnings of now in Italy, for example, right? So that's the kind of political movement that Erdogan is heading. This very strongly nationalist, fiercely independent. The policy stuff is kind of an afterthought, right? He was very strongly free market and was fairly liberal in his beginnings, and now he's pivoting towards something much more state controlled. Whereas on the opposition camp, you have something much more complicated going on. You have, the Erdogan people often say that these people are brought together by their hate for Erdogan or something, and that is distantly true. That's partly true, I guess, in the sense that they are brought together by their opposition to Erdogan, and they're very polarized within themselves, right? That you've got the nationalists in the opposition. You've also got some very strong sort of leftist movements, as well as different ethnicities and stuff. So it's much more of a mixed bag. I'd say what the leadership right now is trying to do is bring a more sort of a Republican tradition back into the mix, where they're trying to anchor, I think, their opposition in the Republican tradition, which is something we could talk about more.
Yeah, I would add to that by saying that, for Erdogan, I think the most important thing to understand, and he's a familiar character, and probably to your listeners, he's been, this is 20 years now he's been in power. At this stage, what Erdogan I think is really fighting for in this election is to continue to hold on to a very clientelist political system that he's established over the last decade. The political economy of Erdogan's power at this point is very much, patron client. Like, he takes care of his people, and his people vote for him because he takes care of them, right? And this is how he's been able to direct. This is most clear really in the aftermath of the earthquake, where he's been able to manage state agencies in such a way that his constituencies are getting the most aid, and the constituencies that tend to vote for the opposition get the least. So that's a system that has been built and constructed bit by bit and piece by piece over the last 10 to 15 years in Turkey, and it's what he's fighting to maintain. For Kılıçdaroğlu and for the opposition camp more broadly, as I've been saying, there's kind of an antinomy in that camp between sort of what holds them to each other and what binds like each camp to its own constituency, right? So like the reason these folks all got together, and really I think the reason they settled on Kılıçdaroğlu as the candidate is because the only way a party like İYİ Party or even the Kurdish HDP, which are outside of this coalition but nonetheless crucial to an opposition victory, get back any kind of power that they used to have is if the opposition wins and Turkey devolves back into a more parliamentary system. And that's the deal Kılıçdaroğlu has brokered with the opposition parties. That's his brainchild. And he was probably the most likely candidate to actually affect that change were he to win. By the same token, it's, as Selim said, it's a very ideologically diverse coalition. E-party voters, the voters, care less about parliamentary democracy and much more about the typical sorts of things that nationalist voters care about. Likewise, CHP voters, they're hurt very much by the economic situation. That's far and away a bigger priority for the voters than returning to parliamentary democracy and so forth. So this is sort of like what is on voters' minds and what is on the minds of the elites in this coalition are kind of on two different tracks. And that's been a theme, I think, throughout this campaign.
Less issue focused, like an election, the election coming up in the States would be, and more kind of Erdogan versus not Erdogan. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think there's a strong anti-Erdogan thread throughout the opposition, but I would also say that like populist anger about Erdogan's performance is absolutely the most powerful unifying factor amongst the opposition. And it is issue-based because it's primarily about Erdogan's handling of the economy and Erdogan's performance in the earthquake, in the aftermath of the earthquake, among many other things. But like I said, and that's going to be the priority if the opposition wins, because that's the crisis that Turkey is facing. But it's not it's not what brought the actual individual elite members of the political parties together to the table in the first place.
I'm really curious about the extent to which the opposition has been able to remain cohesive. I mean, I am a Russia specialist by background, and in Russia, even the lefty opposition that agrees on 95% of topics, they can't stand each other. They never get along. They can never unify. So far, are you seeing cohesion are you seeing them stay together through the race so far and through their cooperation?
Yeah, and that was not obvious. It could have happened many other ways, I think. I mean, the way it's structured is there is a coalition, right? The coalition that formed around the CHP, the main party. It's like Congress in India. This was the party that founded the republic, and that's the sort of the party that Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, the founder of the republic, founded with it, right? So around that party now, there's very small center right parties, I would say. I put them center right, and then there is the E party, which is larger. It's about 10 to 15%, wherever, however you count it. And that's it really for that coalition. And that's about, I'd put it around 30 to 40%, depending on how you count it, right? And then there's another coalition. That's the Workers' Coalition, right? And that's the HDP, or it's now the Left Liberal Green Left Party. It changes because the Kurdish parties keep getting banned, so they have to sort of set up other separate parties that they can sort of skip to whenever their party gets into trouble. So that's the Kurdish left, right? And then they're trying to build up a Turkish left around that. So that's the Turkish Workers' Party. Now, those are the formal coalitions, right? And then they all sort of support Kılıçdaroğlu in the presidential race, but in the parliamentary race, they're not. It's two separate alliances, right? And it's structured that way because the nationalists can't really get along with the leftists, right? So you have that kind of division, which is supposed to be sort of just enough for them to pool their resources in the presidential race, but also be able to say that they're on different sides for the parliamentary race, right? Because these people, they do want some distance from each other. And then even within those coalitions, right? For example, the Nationals, the E Party, walked away for a weekend. It was more than a month ago now, because they didn't want Kılıçdaroğlu to be the presidential candidate. And this was a long-running issue. Kılıçdaroğlu the Nationalists wanted one of the two big mayors. Ekrem İmamoğlu was the mayor of Istanbul, or Mansur Yavaş, the mayor of Ankara, to be the candidate. And Kılıçdaroğlu didn't want that. Those guys were too sort of center right. They were too. I think people felt too much like Erdogan in a way. They weren't really different. They weren't really distinct enough. It wouldn't have been a big break from the Erdogan era. People felt if those people had been elected. So the core tension of the opposition for a long time was who's going to be the presidential candidate, and over that, the nationalists almost separated. And once they did, once the leader of the nationalists held this big, very angry speech on one Friday, she got huge backlash from the entire opposition bloc, saying, "What are you doing? You're endangering our chances." Right. So over the weekend, she reconsidered, and on Monday she came back to the what's called the Table of Six, the core opposition alliance. So there was this very large, I think, considerable pressure from, I would say, the majority of the population on this one person to sort of keep the alliance united.
And it sounds like that's something that will be a prevailing dynamic should the opposition win. But in the interest of continuing down our long list of topics today, Jim, where does the race stand now?
So where the race stands now is, look, I've been watching opinion polls, and God bless whoever it is that aggregates these on Wikipedia. They've been doing a fantastic job, for all of us. But the polling, and again, you got to take this with a healthy chunk of salt. Suggests the Kılıçdaroğlu has a healthy enough lead to take a lead into what looks to be a second round. Sort of what we're heading, and that lead over Erdogan that Kılıçdaroğlu has, it varies between, I want to say, like 2 points and 9 points or something like that. And that's well within the margin of error. This could go either way. The dynamic that I think that's emerged, that's I think somewhat unexpected and probably annoying a lot of the opposition camp, is the emergence of a third minor candidate, Muharrem İnce, who is actually the last guy to challenge Erdogan in a presidential election, a former member of the CHP who has splintered off and founded his own party, and has generated a lot of very memeable, youth-oriented excitement, and is polling, in the like 5, 6, 7% range, which is going to be just enough to basically ensure that this thing goes to a second round. So in Turkey, they have double-staged elections, much like in France and other places, where if no one gets 50% in the first round, you have a runoff. And because, and there was a lot of horse jockeying in the first few weeks to try and get İnce off the ticket or get him to back Kılıçdaroğlu. Look, these egos, some of them are absolutely impenetrable, and I don't think it's going anywhere at this point. And to be honest, if you had asked me, 3 months ago, whether the Kurdish left alliance that Selim was talking about was going to field their own candidate, I would have said it was likely. And that would have certainly, ensured a second round. So I think there's been a lot of ups and downs here in terms of, at the very outset, knowing that the HDP and their alliance was not going to field an independent candidate, thinking, oh, wow, maybe Kılıçdaroğlu has a chance to end this in the first round. And then İnce comes onto the stage. And it seems, now, again, quite likely.
Now, are these memeing youths for this İnce candidate, are they more likely in a second round to switch to the opposition, or are they kind of latent Erdogan fans here? Selim, any thoughts there?
I think they're about 60%, if not more, leaning towards the opposition, so Kılıçdaroğlu. If they had to choose, that's who they would choose.
Yeah, that sounds right. But they're also like predominantly younger voters and first-time voters, many of them. I mean, Turkey has, I think, 7 or 8 million first-time voters in this election, which is something to keep an eye on. It is a young country in that sense.
Worth pulling that thread too. So the young voters, you would say, it tends to lean more, I don't know if left is the right word, but lean more oppositional in their outlook.
They do definitely lead opposition. I think I saw somewhere about 1/3 actually support the HDP of first-time voters, which does sound right to me. I mean, considering that the Kurdish population is younger than the non-Kurdish population, and B, that it's progressive, and young people do tend to be more progressive in Turkey as well as many other places. So that does sound right to me. So Erdogan supporters definitely in the minority among young voters.
Yeah, I think that sounds right too. I think the thing to understand too is that it's two very different types of voter. Someone who is inclined towards the opposition and someone who's inclined towards the AKP. So, like I said before, like the AKP and Erdogan, like has set up this patron client system, and it is like you dig into it, it's deep. These roots run real deep. It goes down to the associational level, the civic society level, the level of schools. And like, if you're a young person, in Turkey who's grown up in that system, it's going to be difficult to kind of break out of that in a certain sense. Whereas if you didn't grow up within that patron client network, all you've had in your life basically is Erdogan and his policies. So it's sort of like that's sort of all you've known if you're a 20-year-old Turk and didn't grow up in an AKP household or in the AKP network. So it makes it difficult for the AKP to expand their base amongst the youth on the one hand, and it also makes it difficult for those that they have to really kind of break out.
Now, one question I have: what we've discussed so far doesn't seem to portend great results for Erdogan based on what has been said. But if you're Erdogan now, what's making you more confident? Are there positives? And I guess my big question is about what we call in the Russia space the administrative resource, the ability to use the levers and arms of the state to secure necessary election results. Is there a chance of voter fraud, local or systemic? Is there, what does he have going for him?
First of all, we have to remember that the last elections he won was 51 point, I don't remember exactly, 0.7, I believe. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But it wasn't a whole lot, right? And now 5 years later, incredible inflation, more than 100%. Consumer inflation is huge. It's really felt. The housing market is in disarray. I mean, even if you are linked up to, as Jim said, Erdogan's networks, you're worse off than before. You're much worse off probably than before if you're in the poor bracket, which most Erdogan supporters are, right? And still, he's polling at 45%, right? So he's lost maybe 6-7% of the national vote despite entirely wrecking the economy for. Well, not for everybody. The economy is still growing. Inequality is rising rapidly. So if you go to a big city, all the high end restaurants are full, right? But households are much worse off, right? So despite all that, having that high level of support shows you that people really care about the sort of the non-material stuff, the imperial stuff. They had the TCG Anadolu, this big new warship. On display in Istanbul, and there were huge lines in front of it because people wanted to go see this thing. I heard of this kid, a distant relative of mine, who traveled from Manisa to Istanbul just to see it on a bus.
How long a trip is that?
It's a day. It's a day you spend on the bus, right? And he couldn't see it because the last day they sort of canceled it. They were like, "Oh, sorry, the president has to like see the ship or something." It was something that had to do with him, right? So people really, if it's guns and butter, a lot of people choose guns. They really want that national greatness. They want meaning in their lives from this thing. So that's something you can always count on, and that's the theme that he's heavily invested in. So that's why he actually timed a lot of project openings for this election, like the electric car that Turkey is now producing. We don't know a whole lot of the details of how it's produced and the financing and the technology behind it, but it is a car that Turkey owns and produces, and they're making a big push with that. They are spending a lot of money towards the elderly, towards sort of people in retirement, to sort of protect them from inflation as much as possible. They do that sort of thing. So those things could work. So, in a way, he still has that, and he is pushing that angle very hard. So in terms of what he can hope for, he can hope for that to continue until election day, I think.
So let's turn now, if we might, to the favorite part of mine in this series, the word or words of the day. And I'd like to ask guests with their regional specializations to bring words in the local language that in some way have to do with the current situation, be that political, national, the vibe broadly. So Jim, what is your word or phrase?
It's one of my favorite and sort of all-purpose atasöz, really, like a saying in Turkish, which is tencere yuvarlanmış kapağına bulmuş, right? Which is means the kettle rolls over and finds its cover, right? There's a lot of uncertainty, I think, in this election. There's uncertainty about how Erdogan will react, about things Erdogan measures he could resort to. I mean, we didn't pick up the question of potential voter fraud. I mean, I think it's important to note that it would be unprecedented for him to interfere with the ballot box to an extent that it would, to the extent necessary for him to win back 5-6% of the votes. It's not out of his power, but if he did it, it's important to note it would be unprecedented, and the reaction from Turks would be probably equally unprecedented. So again, that's my saying, because there's a lot of uncertainty, even in the event that the opposition wins. There's so many open questions about what might happen, following from that.
Selim, over to you.
I actually got two words, one for each side of the political spectrum. So there's the first word is helalleşme, which is the sort of the most important word for Kılıçdaroğlu's campaign and his sort of entire political project, I would argue. Making amends with people who have been sort of historically disadvantaged in Turkey. That's been his line for the past couple of years, about how he wants to make amends with religious people who have felt that they were not sort of acknowledged by the state, and that's sort of closing the grievance gap that supported Erdogan's rise to power so strongly, or also making amends with the Kurds on behalf of the state, making amends with religious minorities, including the Alevi, on behalf of the state, not just the CHP. And on the other side, you have the word beka, which is a word they often use. It means resilience or staying power. It's also one of those older words, and that's often Erdogan's line in these elections. Like, listen, we need to have staying power. We need to establish this grand, very, very robust state that can, last the ages.
Both interesting words, interesting phrase too. Yeah, I think that provides great color. Fun for me to learn, and I hope for listeners too. Let's dive back into the politics and a recent event that was tough in its scale, the earthquake, which was a horrible humanitarian catastrophe. I mean, the pictures I saw, now that they've actually cleaned up the rubble, just shows that some of these cities on the border between Syria and Turkey just almost entirely leveled, and that has to have a political impact. It can't not. I'm curious about your thoughts on the race, and kind of thinking back to some of the world history I took in high school with this ancient Chinese concept of the mandate of heaven, that sometimes natural disasters can be seen as a vote of disapproval from divine beings that the leader is no longer meant to stay. But, whether or not we're using language like that, what does it mean for the race? And Jim, we'll start with you on that one.
Yeah, first of all, the earthquake is, you visit Turkey numerous times. You live there. The fear of an earthquake is always in the back of your mind. It's this ever present. It's a country that exists on so many different fault lines and has experienced many devastating earthquakes in its past. It's and Turkey is not necessarily, compared to some of its neighbors, like an unsafe place to be. It doesn't have the kind of ethnic or civil strife that a lot of its neighbors have. And for me, whenever my parents express concern about me going to Turkey, I'd be like, Mom, Dad, like, the thing that's going to kill me in Turkey is an earthquake, not a terrorist attack. So it's an ever-present fear. Okay, and it's been realized, and the several years ago, 3, 4, 5 years ago, when Erdogan seemed to be like at the peak of his powers, it's the only thing that anyone could imagine taking him down is something on the scale of the earthquake that Turkey experienced 25 years ago in 1999, 2000. That actually was part of the events that led to Erdogan coming into power in the first place. The failure of the then CHP government to adequately respond to an earthquake in Istanbul. The scale, though, of this earthquake is even much larger than that. I mean, I think the official death toll is something in like the range of like 60,000. It's probably much larger than that, which is enormous. So this absolutely has an effect on the election. Two ways in which I think it does. First of all, it strikes right at the heart of that political economy that Erdogan relies on. I mean, so much of the economic miracle that Turkey experienced in the wake of 2008, especially, was built on a hyperactive construction sector that, really relied on the fact that Erdogan's government was issuing, exemptions from earthquake standards left and right. I think the number I saw reported was in the area that the earthquake struck 75,000 buildings constructed with waivers from earthquake standards. I mean, this strikes right at the heart of that political economy question for Erdogan. And on the other hand, one way in which, I mean, the opposition has taken advantage of this in a number of different ways. I'll just say, since Selim brought up the point of Helalishme, one way in which it's been noted recently is, Kılıçdaroğlu in a very virally popular video online last week, speaking about his own background as an Alevi and his, desire to reconcile with people of all Muslim religious stripes in Turkey, at least, had this line, that underneath the rubble of the earthquake were Sunnis and Alevis and Kurds and people of all stripes. That this affected everybody. So in a political sense, I think that's how it's characterized the race at the moment. I wonder if Selim can tell us a little bit more, though, about how it might actually affect the election day, because this is actually my concern. Is you have a lot of displaced people, a lot of displaced voters. And this is a prime opportunity for Erdogan to kind of, meddle in the way that he has in the past in terms of controlling electorates and making sure certain people can reach the polls and other people can't.
Well, what a segue to Selim. What do you think?
Yeah, definitely. Just a note on the theology. I think somebody said this was the most secular earthquake in Turkish history, because whenever there were earthquakes in the past, the Islamists would come out and say that this is God's punishment for having this secular republic, right? And on this one, nothing, right? Radio silence from the Islamists. Apparently, this one is not God's punishment. This is just a natural event that occurs from time to time, and one shouldn't make too big of a deal of it. Now, on the electoral impact. I mean, people sometimes think about the sort of electoral impact on the region itself. Most of the regions that were hit are pretty strong Erdogan supporting regions. Notable exception is Hatay, which votes for the opposition and which was actually worse off in the entire earthquake, as well as the response. Now, I don't think there's going to be too big of a change in terms of the region itself, in terms of people who vote there. If they liked Erdogan before, they're going to keep liking him and they're going to keep supporting him. And people like to do polls, and people have actually polled this, although it's sort of bad in taste. But people have polled it, and it does show that people in the region, in the earthquake-struck regions, do continue to support Erdogan. But I think the main impact is outside of the regions. So if you live in Istanbul, for example, right, especially it also expecting an earthquake in the foreseeable future, right? Certainly within this generation, perhaps in the next 10 years or so, people do think about this a lot. You think about it from time to time. You sort of push it in the back of your mind. If you're sort of very security, or I don't live in Istanbul myself. I live in Ankara, but if you're sort of My sister lived in Istanbul, for example, and I would always, whenever she was moving, I'd always say, okay, is it earthquake proof, right? That was always my first question. And now, all those fears from the back of your mind come towards the foreground. You're questioning that more and more. You feel less safe. That sort of thing can't be good for any sitting government, I think. The feeling that your government can't protect you from that, even though maybe it probably could. Some governments in the world certainly are powerful enough to have that enforcement mechanism. Or perhaps it's not even about power, it's about, how important your life is to this big government, right? I do think people weigh all that, and it does matter, especially in those regions, I think.
Let's take kind of a left turn here from the kind of personal considerations behind voters and turn to the policy angle. This podcast is theoretically and often in practice about Ukraine and what that has meant. Now, of course, the election means we need to focus on that. That's going to have big implications. So I want to explore that. Erdogan has had a policy that I would describe as interesting. It seems that he's been not just neutral, but sometimes on both sides of the war and sometimes at the same time, which I think is remarkable. I'm wondering how much of Turkey's policy towards Ukraine is because of Erdogan's intrinsic interest or because of Turkey's intrinsic interest here. And wondering if Kılıçdaroğlu wins, would you expect there to be a shift in the way that Turkey approaches NATO and Russia and Ukraine, or is the way Erdogan's handled this more reflective of the fact he is a Turk in power?
I'm happy to start there. I thought before, like months ago, before before we even really got started on the campaign, that Erdogan was gearing up for a foreign policy that would portray him in the election as a peacemaker, as someone that had the ability to wield Turkish influence in ways that the opposition can dream of around the world, and that to make a case for his and Turkey's place in the world as a positive one, and that's a little bit of a shift from where Turkey had been for a little while, but Ukraine kind of opened up this space for Erdogan to kind of, I think, correct his own public perception that had been coming, that had been built on more or less like aggression and adventurism in Syria, among other things, over the last 10 years. How well he's accomplished that, I don't know. I mean, you're and to your question about whether that's him or it's Turkey, I think it's both. Turkey has always kind of had a kind of middle ground between the West and Russia that has leaned toward the West, but has not always been in one camp or the other fully, right? And has always known that it could go to Russia or the Soviet Union before that for assistance when it wasn't forthcoming or when it suited them. And in this case, there's real, business interests on both sides. Let's put it that way, and that's what's driving a lot of this policy. If Kılıçdaroğlu were to win, I would expect things to be different, but still independent in a certain way. I mean, again, there's so much that's hard to predict about foreign policy under an opposition under Kılıçdaroğlu, in part because it's not been a focus of the campaign for them. It's been, the opposition has run a very domestic issue focused campaign, and in part because the policies that they've put out have been quite generalistic, I think. So that's my reading on why they do this. But yeah, Selim, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree. In terms of the war in Ukraine, I mean, look, Erdogan, since he was very young, has had a vision for what he wants the country to be. Right, he wants the country to be its own empire, right? Its own sort of axis of power, the way they put it. It's not dependent on any other clubs, anybody else's club, the EU's or NATO or anything else. That it can pull its own weight and have its own sphere of influence, that smaller countries around it that depend on it, right? That's what he wants, very much, right? That's the sort of driving vision. And any event X outside of Turkey's borders, he's going to look at and say, how can I manipulate this in order to get to my goal faster, right? So when the war in Ukraine happened, I think he looked at it and said, okay, I can work with this, right? And he looked at the possible ways that he could sort of use that in order to get ahead. It's a good market for cutting edge weapons, for example. Well, tap into that. As Jim said, you could it could make you a peacemaker, right? Well, let's try that a little bit and see how it goes, right? Oh, there's this grain deal. Let's maintain connections to both sides and see what you can do, right? Because he correctly saw, I think, that he had a unique relationship with Putin, and he had this relationship to the West that just doesn't die, right? That's just institutionally based, grounded, right? That the West has to sort of tolerate Turkey's position, even though it may not support it, it may not like it, right? So he's got this wedge that he uses very effectively to get closer to his personal goal, which he believes is also the country's national goal. So in that sense, it's been working out well, I think, for the Erdogan vision of the world and of Turkey. Now, if the opposition, I think, comes to power, I mean, it depends. It depends on how they build their relationship. They have very little foreign policy experience. The CHP has very little governing experience in general, right? You can sort of tell who's going to be in charge of the economy, but it's very difficult to tell who's going to be in charge of foreign policy, right? CHP has usually had some retired diplomats in the stable, sort of, but those guys aren't really, they're seldom workhorses. They don't really do a whole lot of negotiating. They don't really do a whole lot of outreach. It's a very closed-in party. So if they got into power, I think would depend on how the international community approaches them, right? How the Europeans approach them, how the Americans approach them, and how they can make their jobs easier. If they come and say, listen, we can help you get financing, for example, that might be very important to them, and that might make their lives easier, right? And that would then create dependency that I guess they would also be wary of. So it depends on how it all plays out. But in general, they'd be much more pro-NATO. They'd be less likely to sort of create problems. Small problems would not blow up into big crises right away, the way they do now, I think.
Mm-hmm. We have time for one more question, and I want to ask for folks who are following the election day of, does Turkey have a Wisconsin? What should we be following? Where are the swing demographics or swing places? If you have to follow one place or one thing, and let's leave it to only one, what would you be looking at? And Jim, I'm going to put you on the spot.
Well, the largest single municipality in Turkey is Istanbul. It's also its most diverse. And it is, or it can be read as a bellwether for the rest of the country if you're able to follow along on a district by district level and know, for instance, are Kurdish communities in Istanbul, going one way or the other. That may signal, and now there's not always a one-to-one correlation here, but it may signal how Kurdish communities in the southeast are going. Likewise, Istanbul is also a city of immigrants itself, right? And people who live in Istanbul know where their home district or region is elsewhere in the country, and there's also high correlation for voting between those. So if it's sort of, hopefully this is an answer, but like if you're able to identify, a few key districts in Istanbul and say, oh, this is going to tell you where the Black Sea is going, or oh, this is going to tell you where the Southeast is going. If you know where those populations are located, and those of us who follow this really granularly do, that's as much of a bellwether as you're going to get. But polls closing all around the same time makes this a little tough to, to do in real time.
Any thoughts there, Selim?
I agree. Istanbul is really important, I think. And Erdogan always says, wherever Istanbul goes, the nation goes. And he came out of Istanbul. He was Istanbul mayor, and then became prime minister. And it is, as Jim said, really connected to pretty much everywhere in the country. One sort of pet peeve I have sometimes with people is people talk about Anatolia or Inner Anatolia sometimes, about how like that's the heartland of the country, and that's especially important. So my parents drove from Izmir to Ankara to visit us recently, my wife and I, and we're saying, you guys here in Ankara, you're in the opposition, but actually we drove through Anatolia and things are different there. Like, listen, like this country is like 75% urban now. It's the metropolises are very important, and they create all the culture. They have this huge gravitational pull. So why do we continue to speak as though the sort of rural voter, I guess it's similar in the United States, where when you look at the electoral map, these vast swaths of lots of red and dots of blue, but the dots of blue are highly populated, right? It's kind of similar in Turkey. So I think, yeah, the cities are very important. They're going to keep being very important, and they do determine the direction of the sort of general direction of politics in the country.
Well, on an etymological point, as far as I know, Istanbul is just a mishearing of Greek saying the city. It is the city. It is the center of gravity. So on that note, lots to follow in the coming weeks. Thank you to both of you for joining. I'll be sure to keep updated on this election as events unfold. So who's going to win? I guess we'll find out soon. Thanks to our guests, Jim and Selim, for joining, and to you, listener, for joining as well. I'm really excited you're here on this learning journey with me. The Continent Podcast is a project of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, that's FPRI, a nonpartisan think tank based in Philadelphia. For more information on this initiative and on many others, visit fpri.org. We'll catch you next month.